The dead have their own ways of staying close through whispers, shadows, and chilling apparitions that defy explanation. Tonight, we bring you 4 terrifying true paranormal encounters where the restless spirits make their presence known. From eerie whispers in an attic to ghostly figures in abandoned windows, these stories will leave you questioning what's waiting in the dark. Welcome to Dark Tales Daily, if you dare to listen. The Whispering Attic. When we first moved into the old house on Maple Street, I thought it was perfect. It was a little run down, sure, but it had charm, creaky hardwood floors, a wraparound porch, and an attic that my husband, Ben, said would make a great storage space. I'd always loved older homes with their history and character. But now I think there's a reason some history stays buried. The first night, everything seemed fine. Exhausted from unpacking, we collapsed into bed, lulled to sleep by the gentle creaks and groans of the old house, settling. It wasn't until the second night that I heard it. It was faint at first, like the sound of the wind brushing against the eaves. I told myself it was nothing, just the house adjusting to the colder air. But as I lay there, I realized it wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, almost like a voice. I nudged Ben awake, but by the time he stirred, the sound had stopped. "You're imagining things," he muttered before rolling over and going back to sleep. I wanted to believe him, but the unease gnawed at me. I lay awake for hours, listening for it to return. When it didn't, I convinced myself I'd been hearing things. Maybe I was just tired. But then it happened again. And again. Every night at 3 a.m., like clockwork, the faint whispers would begin. They weren't words I could understand, just murmurs that seemed to come from the attic, drifting down through the floorboards like a ghostly hum. It gave me chills, but I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal that had found its way inside. Still, I avoided going up there. Something about the attic felt wrong. A week later, I finally worked up the courage to mention it to Ben. He laughed it off, teasing me about having an overactive imagination. But when I insisted, he agreed to check it out. Together, we climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, armed with a flashlight and a broom, just in case. The attic was exactly what you'd expect. Dusty beams, cobwebs, and a few forgotten boxes left behind by the previous owners. Ben poked around with the broom, muttering about mice, but we didn't find anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone up there. As we were about to leave, I noticed something. Near the far wall, partially hidden under a pile of old newspapers, was a small wooden chest. It was unremarkable, worn and scratched with age, but something about it made my stomach twist. "Let's leave it," I said quickly, but Ben was already opening it. Inside were a handful of dusty trinkets, an old pocket watch, a faded photograph, and a small, leather-bound notebook. Ben shrugged, unimpressed, and handed me the notebook. I hesitated before flipping it open. The pages were filled with scrawled handwriting, some kind of journal. The entries were strange, fragmented, as if the writer had been slowly losing their grip on reality. The final entry was the most unsettling. "It whispers to me every night. I thought I could ignore it, but now it knows my name. It won't stop until I listen." That night, the whispers came again. But this time they weren't faint. They were louder, clearer. And this time they were saying my name. "Anna!" I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I shook Ben awake, but as soon as he sat up, the whispers stopped. He looked at me with a mix of concern and frustration. "Anna, you've got to let this go. It's just an old house." But I knew it wasn't. Something was in that attic, and it knew me. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept hearing the whispers in my head, even in broad daylight. Finally, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. While Ben was at work, I climbed back up to the attic. The chest was still there, and so was the notebook. This time I read through it carefully, piecing together the writer's descent into paranoia. The entries spoke of a presence in the attic, something that whispered and watched, something that grew stronger the more it was ignored. "You must not listen to it," one entry warned. "The moment you acknowledge it, you're lost." I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The writer had eventually stopped making entries. I didn't want to imagine why. As I turned to leave, the attic door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through me as I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers started again, louder than ever, echoing all around me. "Anna! Anna!" I backed into the corner, trembling as the whispers grew into a cacophony. Then, just as suddenly as they'd begun, they stopped. The silence was deafening, and then I heard it, a single deliberate creak from the floorboards behind me. Slowly, I turned around. There was nothing there, but as I stared into the shadows, I realized I wasn't alone. The darkness seemed to shift, coalescing into a shape that wasn't quite human. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and I couldn't look away. That was the last thing I remember before I woke up on the floor of the attic, the door wide open and sunlight streaming in. I haven't been back up there since. The chest is gone, I made sure of that, but the whispers haven't stopped. Every night at 3 a.m., I hear them calling my name. I don't know what it wants, but I know one thing for certain. The attic isn't empty, and it never was. The girl at the window. I moved into the neighborhood a month ago. It was a quiet, tree-lined street with houses that all seemed to have been frozen in time, aging but well-loved. My new home was small but cozy, the kind of place I could see myself growing into. But from the very first night, something felt off. It started with the house next door. It was different from the others. While every other home had warm lights glowing from the windows or kids' bikes propped against the porches, this house sat in silence, its windows dark and empty. The paint was peeling, the yard overgrown. No one seemed to go in or out. I figured it was abandoned. Until I saw her. I was unpacking boxes late one evening when I glanced out my window. Across the driveway, through the second-story window of the old house, I saw a girl. She couldn't have been more than 10 or 11. She stood perfectly still, staring straight at me. I froze, unsure what to do. Her pale face was framed by long dark hair, and her expression was unreadable, neither friendly nor hostile. Just blank. I gave a hesitant wave. She didn't respond, didn't move. I looked away for just a moment, uncomfortable under her unblinking gaze. But when I looked back, she was gone. The next day, I asked my neighbor across the street about the house, an older woman named Mrs. Carter. She had lived here for decades and knew everything about everyone. "That house has been empty for years," she said, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place, pity, maybe, or fear. "The family that lived there moved away after the tragedy." "What tragedy?" I asked, my stomach sinking. Mrs. Carter hesitated, then lowered her voice. "The little girl, she drowned in the backyard pool. Her parents couldn't bear to stay after that." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you sure no one's living there now?" "Positive," she said firmly. "No one's been there in years." That night I couldn't stop thinking about the girl. Had I imagined her? Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my mind playing games with me after hearing the story. But when I looked out the window, there she was again. She stood in the same spot, her face as pale as moonlight, her hair draped over her shoulders like a curtain. This time her head was tilted slightly, as if curious. I wanted to look away, but something about her held me there, like a rabbit caught in a predator's gaze. I decided I needed to know for sure. Grabbing my phone, I stepped out into the cool night air. The street was silent, the only sound the crunch of gravel under my feet as I approached the old house. My heart pounded with each step. The front yard was eerily still, the weeds swaying in the faint breeze. I made my way to the door, but it was locked. Peering through the dusty windows, I could see nothing but shadows. The house smelled of mildew and decay, as if it had been sealed off for decades. I walked around to the backyard, where the remnants of a broken fence surrounded what had once been a pool. Now it was just a pit of cracked tiles and stagnant water, choked with dead leaves. Standing there, I felt the weight of silence pressing down on me. Then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. She was there, in the second-story window, staring down at me. But this time her expression had changed. She wasn't blank anymore. She was smiling. But there was something wrong with her smile. It was too wide, stretching unnaturally across her pale face, revealing teeth that were jagged and dark. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the pool. My phone slipped from my hands, its flashlight bouncing wildly. When I looked back at the window, she was gone again. I ran home, locking every door and pulling every curtain shut. My heart was racing, my mind reeling. Who, or what, was she? And why was she watching me? That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I told myself I wouldn't look out the window again, but curiosity got the better of me. When I finally peeked out, the house was dark, lifeless. But as I turned away, something caught my eye, a faint movement. I looked again, and there she was, not in the window this time, but standing in the yard, halfway between her house and mine. The sight of her standing there, motionless, sent a wave of cold terror through me. Her head was still tilted, her wide smile gleaming in the dim light. I backed away from the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I packed a bag and left, checking into a motel on the other side of town. I told myself I needed space to clear my head, to convince myself it was all just stress or exhaustion. But even here, far from the house, I can't shake the feeling that she's still watching. Last night, when I closed the curtains in my motel room, I caught a glimpse of something in the parking lot. A pale figure, standing perfectly still, her head tilted, and that impossibly wide smile stretched across her face. I don't know how she followed me. I don't know if I can escape her. But one thing is certain. She isn't just a girl, and she isn't going to stop. The shadow in the photograph. Photography had always been my escape. A weekend trip to the countryside was the perfect way to disconnect from the endless noise of city life, from the humdrum routine of work, from everything. It was just me, my camera, and the open road. The trip was peaceful, uneventful even. I spent hours wandering through quiet forests, snapping pictures of old barns and weathered fences, capturing the golden hues of sunset reflected on still ponds. I felt free, lighter than I had in months. When I returned home Sunday evening, I eagerly transferred the photos from my camera to my laptop. That's when I noticed it. The shadow. At first it was subtle, almost easy to miss. In the corner of a photo of an old stone bridge there was a dark, blurry shape. It didn't make sense. The sun had been high that day, the light bright and direct. There was nothing nearby that could have cast such a shadow. I assumed it was a smudge on the lens or a trick of the light, but as I scrolled through the photos, I saw it again, and again. In every image, no matter where I had been or what I had photographed, the shadow was there. Sometimes it was faint, tucked into the background like a forgotten memory. Other times it was more pronounced, a long, angular shape that seemed to stretch unnaturally, always just out of focus. The realization sent a chill through me. Whatever it was, it hadn't been there when I was taking the pictures. I would have noticed, wouldn't I? I zoomed in on one of the photos, my hands trembling as I adjusted the resolution. The closer I looked, the more wrong it seemed. The shadow wasn't just a shape. It had form, something like a figure, but distorted, as if it didn't belong in the frame. The worst part, it seemed to be facing the camera. By the time I got to the last photo, my heart was pounding. It was a picture I had taken just before heading home, a self-portrait using the timer. I had set up the camera on a tripod near an old barn, posing casually with my back to the structure. But I wasn't alone in the photo. Behind me, just barely visible in the doorway of the barn, was the shadow. This time it wasn't blurred or faint. It was sharp, defined, a tall humanoid figure with long limbs and no discernible features, standing perfectly still. It was watching me. I slammed the laptop shut and stumbled away from the desk, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mind raced with possibilities. Could someone have been following me? But how could they have appeared in every photo without me noticing? And how could their shadow stretch in ways that defied the angles of the light? That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was all just a bizarre coincidence. But then I started seeing the shadow outside of the photos. It began subtly, like a dark shape flickering just at the edge of my vision. I'd turn quickly, expecting to see someone there, but nothing was ever there. At first, I convinced myself it was my mind playing tricks, but the occurrences grew more frequent, more deliberate. One evening, as I sat editing the photos, I felt it, an oppressive weight like someone was standing behind me. Slowly, I turned toward the doorway of my room. The hallway beyond was shrouded in shadows, but one shadow was darker, deeper. It lingered at the edge of the light, unmoving. I froze, unable to look away. Then, without a sound, it moved, sliding across the wall like smoke, disappearing into the darkness. The next day, I deleted every photo from the trip, hoping that would be enough to rid myself of whatever this was. But it didn't work. If anything, it made things worse. The shadow began appearing in other photos, pictures I hadn't even taken during the trip. A snapshot of my family from last Christmas now had a faint, dark figure lurking in the background. A selfie I had taken months ago showed it standing just behind my shoulder. It was everywhere. I tried to tell someone, anyone, but who would believe me? A shadow haunting my photos sounded absurd, even to me. But the fear was real. I stopped taking pictures, stopped using my camera altogether, but the shadow didn't leave. It crept into my reflections, into the edges of my vision, into the corners of every room I entered. Last night I woke to a soft, scraping sound, like fingernails against glass. My heart sank as I realized it was coming from the window. Trembling, I reached for the lamp, but before I could turn it on, a low, guttural whisper filled the room. "Why? Did you look?" The voice was soft but unmistakable, and it seemed to echo from everywhere at once. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. And then I saw it, a tall, dark figure pressed against the window pane, its hollow face inches from the glass. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out because I woke up this morning on the floor, the lamp shattered beside me. The window was closed, locked as it had been the night before. But on the glass, faint but undeniable, were streaks like long skeletal fingers dragging down the pane. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but I know one thing. It isn't done with me. And every time I close my eyes, I see it. The shadow, waiting, watching. And I know it will follow me wherever I go. The Haunted Motel Room. I hadn't planned to stop in that town. It was one of those nameless places you pass on a long drive, a scattering of gas stations, diners, and motels surrounded by endless fields. But a storm was rolling in, and the rain had turned the roads slick and treacherous. My car's headlights barely pierced the downpour, so when I saw the flickering neon sign for the Silver Pines Motel, I pulled in. The place was a dump, with peeling paint and a sagging roof, but it was dry. The man behind the counter barely looked up as he handed me the key to room 13. I hesitated at the number, a silly superstition, I told myself, and trudged through the rain to the room. The first thing that hit me when I stepped inside was the smell. It was faint but unmistakable, like damp wood mixed with something sour. The room was small and sparse, a creaky bed, a battered nightstand, and a TV that looked like it hadn't worked since the 90s. The walls were an ugly beige, cracked in places, with peeling wallpaper. One corner had deep scratches as if something had clawed at it. The storm outside raged on, lightning illuminating the room in harsh bursts. I was exhausted, so I threw my bag on the chair and collapsed onto the bed. The sheets were stiff, the mattress lumpy, but I didn't care. Sleep came quickly. I woke to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, just a soft, rhythmic noise coming from the wall behind the bed. I froze, my heart pounding. Probably a mouse, I thought, or maybe the wind pushing a branch against the side of the building. But the scratching grew louder. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, insistent, as if someone or something was trying to get through. I turned on the bedside lamp and sat up, my eyes scanning the room. The sound stopped. I let out a shaky laugh. Just my imagination, I whispered to myself. But then the lamp flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed the room, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning from the storm outside. My breath quickened as I fumbled for my phone. The dim glow of the screen illuminated the room, just enough for me to see that the scratches on the wall weren't just in one corner anymore. They stretched further now, long, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw it, a shape, darker than the shadows around it. It was crouched low, almost blending into the blackness, but I could see the glint of its eyes watching me. I bolted for the door, my heart racing, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been welded shut. My phone slipped from my hands and hit the floor, the screen going dark. The scratching started again, louder now, coming from all around me. The walls seemed to tremble, the sound echoing and overlapping, until it felt like the entire room was alive. I pressed my back against the door, my hands shaking, as the figure in the corner began to move. It didn't walk, it crawled, its limbs too long and bending at unnatural angles. Its head tilted, and I swear I heard it whisper my name. Michael. The sound wasn't coming from its mouth. It was everywhere, reverberating through the room. My knees buckled as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was closer now, its features just barely visible in the flickering light from outside. Its face was wrong. No eyes, no nose, just a mouth that stretched impossibly wide, filled with rows of jagged, blackened teeth. The air grew colder, my breath visible in front of me. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. And then the TV turned on, static crackling through the speakers. The screen flickered, showing distorted images that didn't make sense. Faces twisting in agony, hands clawing at the screen, mouths screaming silently. The figure stopped, its head snapping toward the TV as if distracted. Seizing the moment, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light hit the creature, and it recoiled, letting out an inhuman screech that made my ears ring. It scrambled back into the corner, merging with the shadows. The scratching stopped. I didn't wait to see if it would return. With a surge of desperation, I threw my shoulder against the door, and this time it gave way. I stumbled into the rain-soaked night, my shoes splashing in the puddles as I ran to my car. The engine roared to life on the first try, and I sped away, not daring to look back. It wasn't until I was miles away that I finally pulled over, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat, jolting me out of my daze. It was a notification. Photos had been uploaded to my cloud. Confused, I unlocked the phone and opened the gallery. My stomach dropped. There were photos of me taken in the motel room. In each one, I was sleeping, my face lit by the pale glow of the bedside lamp. And in every photo, the figure was there, standing over me, its mouth stretched into that awful, jagged grin. I don't know what followed me out of that room or why it let me leave. But every night since, I've woken at exactly 3:13 a.m. to the faint sound of scratching. And I know one thing. It's only a matter of time before it finds me again. Sometimes the dead don't rest quietly, and the veil between their world and ours grows thin. Tonight's stories remind us that whispers in the attic, shadows in photographs, or even the room you sleep in might hide something sinister. What would you do if the paranormal found you? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us tomorrow for more chilling tales on Dark Tales Daily. Sweet dreams, if you can sleep.